Okay, open data. Welcome. First time we're doing this, which is really exciting. It's been a long time coming. It is one of the most interesting and potentially important parts of the decentralized web. I really am enjoying this D-Web term more than Web3. I'm a big fan of the words of people like David Grieber, who recognize that any label we give to the work that we do together is almost inevitably recuperated by the overarching system of extractive capital. And the point is not to get attached to particular labels, but to use them to find the others. So I've been loving DWeb and thinking about how open data might play into some of the dreams that we have and that have been prevalent for many, many years since the very beginning of the internet and perhaps even before that. So as we kind of get into that, let me just think one moment to make sure there's no feedback. If you had the chance while we were listening to Paul Isaac and thinking about young roots and strong shoots and the foundation of community, then you might have done this already, but please make sure to introduce yourself in the Open Data Guild's channel. You can follow the format on the slide here, or you can do whatever else you like, because this is Kernel, and we're not here to tell you exactly how to be. We're just here to suggest gently what the next steps along your adventure may be, without ever coercing you to act in any kind of particular way. Where I wanted to start today, and you can find the link to all of this, is by going through the first two pieces, which is the introduction to the Open Data Guild and a essay called Transfinity. Before I go in and present some of the ideas there in a hopefully less wordy way, I also just thought I would give you the structure for the guild itself, which is that we will run 4 sessions in this guild. This session now will be largely a presentation, because there's a lot of context that needs to be set at the beginning of this work, which will help us in the sort of 3 sessions after this, all of which will be much more technical and participatory. So this session is a presentation and a discussion. There's no code, there's no technical requirements. Everybody is very, very welcome. And everybody is welcome for the whole guild, but it is important to state up front that the next 3 sessions we will be looking at a Dune dashboard and forking it and extending it. We will be looking at subgraphs and thinking about how to call the API that they expose and potentially building our own. We will be thinking about transfer mechanisms and how tokens might be used to enable reciprocal and interdependent relationships as it relates to the transfer of information and its storage, because storage is really just transfer over time. And all of these require not just the conceptual groundwork, which I hope to lay today, but also, diving in and getting our hands dirty with some, as I say, Dune dashboards, subgraphs, and the like. So the next 3 sessions will be a little bit more technical. We will give you details for those in the channel so that you can take a look before we spring them on you 2 weeks from now. The next session will be October 11th. We have a dear and delightful friend from a previous kernel block called Christian St. Louis, and he will be helping with some of those Dune dashboards. We will be going over subgraphs and the rest of it. So that is the putative structure. Now, what I would like to do is kind of attempt in 30 minutes or so to summarize what is on the introductory page and in the first essay and in the Open Data Guild in the build section of the kernel website. And then we can open it up to some wider discussion of the implications of some of these ideas, as well as their application in various different places. So this begins with open what? And as it always does with me, we go and look at what the words that we're using actually mean, what their traces are through the language that we now speak. And data comes from the Latin datum, which means something given, right? It's a past participle, so it includes time, and it is this notion of like something given here already as it means like established as factual, right? Like it is given that this man went to the coffee shop this morning and therefore is ready to give his presentation. There's this delightful double entendre in something given, which we will be playing with throughout this whole guild, right? Because it means established as factual, but also has like the connotation of given, as in a gift. And so the introduction, if you read it on the build in the build section, is playing with this and suggesting that when we understand that data is something given, then we can agree on its value in time, right? And when we open it, when we open up access or the ability to participate in the creation and curation of data, then we can illumine more valuable ways to pass our time together, right? There's a very interesting, like double directedness is what Derrida would call it, but there's a double meaning involved in this, which we will be looking at more deeply in a few slides. In order to like understand this particular feature of data, that it is both that which is established and factual and most valuable when shared, open, and given, as in a gift, we need to think outside of traditional economic lenses, which is not to say that we throw away economic theory at all. It's just to say that we're more interested in this old Greek word, which is called agalmix. And that is the word that we will be using to frame the whole guild and try and capture the double directedness of datum as something given. Agalmix is the study and practice of the production and allocation of non-scarce goods. I will say that a few times in this presentation, so don't worry if it doesn't land at first. The most important thing there is non-scarce goods, right? How do we produce and allocate them? Now, if you look in the introduction, you'll see a quote from a different part of the kernel syllabus, which is in module 5, which is about token design and mechanisms. And it's a particular piece called pro-social universes, if you look in the sidebar. And it speaks about the research work done by a game collective, a computer game collective called Project Horseshoe, who wrote 3 separate papers, one on logistics, one on economics, and one on the psychology of games. In particular, they focused on how to create pro-social games. And one of the quotes from Daniel Cook and the other authors of that essay is, appropriately designed knowledge good economies, I've replaced economies with agolmias because we'll be using those. Appropriately designed knowledge good agolmias mean more smart players are an advantage, not a threat. Right? This is what we're trying to build towards, right? Where like smart people, broadly defined, it certainly doesn't mean educated in one particular way or intellectual in a narrow meaning of the term. The more people that we can include and the more people that we can get participating in the creation, collection, and curation of collective knowledge, the greater the advantage we are at, rather than this being a threat. That is one way of thinking about like the aim to which we're going. I have some more simple ways of phrasing it, but the critical point to understand here is that the supply of like so-called knowledge goods in this paper, Daniel Cook and the rest of the authors are talking about the fact that like as you're thinking about pro-social design, you need to think about positive sum resources, right? And positive sum resources, the best examples we have of those are time and knowledge, right? And then they go into greater detail about these knowledge resources, thinking about like what positive sum transformations on goods really are. The classic example is that wood burned in an oven is like the same amount of wood will produce much more heat than wood burned in an open fireplace. And this is like a non-zero sum transformation via knowledge on certain resources, right? So knowledge, our ability to understand the mechanics of the world, describe it, share it with one another, and enact it in shared reality allows us to use resources in more efficient ways, i.e. positive sum transformations. What's most interesting about this, right, particularly in the context of agalmias, the study of the production and allocation of non-scarce goods, is that when we're talking about these positive sum resources, time, knowledge, what is traditionally in like other literature called non-rival goods, right? Goods that I can share with you without diminishing my own supply. We're not so much interested in demand and supply curves. Again, this is not to like shit on economics, right? There's like really, really good theory there which will apply to how we think about these things. It's just that in the context of agalmias, we're less interested in demand and supply curves because the more supply there is of knowledge, the greater the demand there is for it too, right? They're not in the same relationship as they are in like scarce economies or economies that are premised upon scarce goods. Knowledge and time operate differently. And so what we're mostly interested in here is the transfer mechanisms we can design and the sorts of collective wisdom they can help us cultivate. And like that's again like a critical point which will be used to frame the whole guild. We're not so much interested in like the demand and supply of data. It doesn't really make sense to talk about that in the same sense that economists would talk about like demand and supply as it relates to some physical good. We're much more interested in how data is stored and transferred, remembering that storage is just a particular case of transfer over time, right? And so like this transfer is really like the whole thing, right? And in that paper on pro-social design, the authors write that when setting up transfer mechanisms, they're talking in the context of computer games and internal economies, which is another whole world and very, very interesting and a place that we can learn a great deal from. But they write, when setting up transfer mechanisms, try to create a natural interdependency between players, right? This is, for me, like such a beautiful way of thinking about how we can approach transfer mechanisms, especially in the world of open data. The example that they give in this paper, just to kind of ground it, right, is that, like, for instance, knowledge goods, because they're positive sum resources, can be used to create much more pro-social environments in your game by, for instance, ensuring that like a paladin level player has to teach some particular skill to a novice in order to advance to the next level, right? By teaching that skill, he doesn't lose it, but in fact strengthens his understanding or her understanding in some really important way. And only by teaching and passing on that skill in this agalmic sense, in this non-rivalrous sense, can you advance to the next level. This is a wonderful example of pro-social design in games, and can begin us thinking about what interdependent transfer mechanisms might actually mean in the context of the D-Web and open data. Now, as I said, this particular point about something given and the double-directedness of it sort of is best expressed through trying to discuss why does all of this matter? Why speak about agalmics and interdependency, reciprocity, and openness? Like, why do we really care, right? And the claim that the introductory section makes is that when we can establish facts which are shared by more people, we can create more value. Right? This seems like a truism when you pull it out and put it as a single sentence, but there are a few things that I want to say on it because it, I think, helps illuminate the double-directedness of datum. The first is that there is a wonderful video linked both here and in the beginning of Module 5, because they have a great deal to do with each other, which goes to a talk given by Rich Hickey. Rich Hickey is the designer of Clojure, which is a functional language, and just one of the most interesting computer scientists and language designers of our generation. And he makes this enormously simple point that facts are values, right? Again, like the Latin, he has the same addiction as I do to going back to the dictionary and looking at the etymology of words. And like facts are values, right? Like the Latin for it is factum. So it's again a past participle in the sense that it includes time. And facts are values. And like it's just a simple value entered into some collective record. And facts don't change, right? This is what's really interesting about them. It's like the fact that Bill Clinton was president of the United States doesn't change when a new president comes along, right? Rich gives this example in order to illustrate why we should have like append-only logs rather than like changing facts in place. He's speaking specifically about like object-oriented languages and their use in databases, but it makes like a much more broad point, right? Which is that like we so often collapse the notion of fact and truth, which is like a danger that this particular guild runs, especially like the way that I've used the language to frame these two pieces on the website. But I want to be very, very clear in this presentation that like a fact is just a value in like some shared space, right? It doesn't necessarily have to do with capital T truth, but what we do sort of really, really try to emphasize throughout kernel, and you will remember this from the trust module last week, module 1 in kernel, is that like value in the social psychological sense, right, is a function of trust in shared truths. Here we've adapted that slightly and we said value is a function of trust in that which is given, right, to try and make it clear that like this is not like capital T truth. There's no access to like universal and absolute truth as far as like the syllabus is concerned. What we're talking about is our ability to share facts in a way that enables us to act collectively and in increasingly wise ways in the world, right? The fact that facts are values means that the more facts we can share literally creates more values, right? More values in the ledger that we're all using. And the fact that that ledger is shared and that we can trust that it is shared according to certain consensus rules across all participants means that we can like generate more value in this like more difficult to quantify social psychological sense of that word, right? Not just some numeric or other tightly knit like a narrowly represented thing, but value broadly speaking, as in that which matters to us. And so the claim for this entire guild, right, is that if we can develop mechanisms to share data between more people, we can establish more valuable truths. And there I did, fall into my own trap because I'm a man of many contradictions and I have learned to delight in it. I still do not use capital T truth, but I do think that like mechanisms that allow us to share more data in more transparent and verifiable ways between more people do enable like a more truthful and therefore valuable world. So just to kind of double tap on this, right? Datum, something given, which means by definition, right, that data is most effective and meaningful when it can be shared. And this helps us explain at a conceptual level why closed data that is kept in databases away from the public eye and then sold to the highest bidder for advertising revenue and targeting, why that becomes toxic. Because like conceptually, we've known this since literally the dawn of humanity, right? That when that which is given becomes static, when you don't give your gift on, when you keep hold of it, when you're not able to express your natural talent, when you don't pass the gift to the empty place, which is something that we'll talk about in module 7, it becomes poisonous. It becomes toxic. And this is like the conceptual reason I understand why like keeping data behind closed doors makes it really toxic, right? And I don't mean that like pejoratively. I mean that in the sense of GDPR or like the Californian laws on data or POPI in South Africa, whatever it is, right? It's like it's really risky to keep personally identifying information because if you get hacked, like then you get hauled out before Congress or wherever you are and asked why you didn't have better security. But it's really, really difficult to protect data because it is that which is given. In the nature of any gift and in the nature of that which can be established as fact, it is most valuable when it is shared. And so the question becomes, how are we to best represent the value of non-scarce goods so that we can produce and distribute them in reciprocally enriching ways, right? This is like one of the deeper sort of questions that flows from the framing question for the whole guild. If you read the introduction page again, it's, can open data facilitate friendship, right? Can we, through the use of data which is open, accessible, and in which we can participate, can we come to more friendly ways of being in the world? And can it help us be better friends to one another and within the systems in which we participate? So I think that the answer is like data already given. It's a gull mix. And I told you that I would repeat this a few times. A gull mix, again, is the study and practice of the production and allocation of non-scarce goods. This quote itself is non-scarce in the presentation, which I will also share in the Guild channel after this. So I thought I would just, enact how non-scarce it is by sticking it back in there, because it does have a lot to do with what it means to program systems in an open manner that is reciprocally enriching. Remembering that in kernel, we define wealth only as having enough to share. Right? And so, in fact, it is only possible to be rich together. That is really just like one of these like simple truisms, which again, like we seem to have in some really important way forgotten in the systems that we currently operate within. So here is the most wordy slide of the whole presentation. I won't read it all, but if you, again, go into Transfinity in the open data build section, and you will see these 8 points which help us define exactly what a gullmix are, like what an agalmia is as opposed to an economy. These come from the P2P Foundation. They have a wonderful wiki, and there are just some really the whole wiki is wonderful, and I encourage you to read through it and learn some of the lessons of P2P experiments and ideas over the last 20 or 30 years, sometimes even longer. But here it's really useful because they give us the 8 defining features of a gullmix. The first is that they're transfinite. And this is the fancy word for non-rival, but it's so much fun that that's what we're calling this guild session, Transfinity. And the definition is simple. When I give you $1, I have $1 less than I previously did, whereas galmic activity involves goods which are not scarce, so I can give you one without appreciably diminishing my supply. I'm going to come back to this because there's a gotcha in there, but that should give you the idea of transfinity and how it applies to agalmics. The other notions are that they are cooperative. While they are cooperative, they're also self-interested, right? In the sense of umuntu gumuntu gabantu, right? Like a human being is a human being through other human beings. So the point is that you can like be like self-interested in communal ways. Like another kind of example of this is that, like the pursuit of self-knowledge, for instance, is one of the most profoundly selfish activities you can engage in. But if you cast your mind back to week 0 and Paul Myberg talking about water and thirst, he says that they became so thirsty they crawled into tiny balls in what little shade there was in the Kalahari and lowered their metabolic rates and changed their breathing just to survive. And he was so thirsty that he came to understand that there was no such thing as thirst. There was only having water and not having water. And in between, there's nothing. And there's something really interesting about that notion that like when you follow something honestly all the way to its opposite, you come back to the original thing. And there's something really interesting about this interplay between like our ability to be self-interested in cooperative manners, our ability to cooperate in self-interested ways. Because like when you truly know yourself, then you know that like you're not different from anybody else. And it's that kind of like profoundly selfish activity which leads you to the most selfless of places. And agalmics somehow seem to capture something really interesting about that general pattern. I know that I've been speaking at an analogical level, but I think that it is a general pattern which applies both to protocols and to poetry and kind of everything in between. So then cooperative and self-interested, they're self-stimulating and self-directing, right? So like this is the sense that like they don't operate according to general supply-demand principles, because the more knowledge we have, the more questions there are and the greater the demand for more knowledge, right? This is why in like the Zen tradition, for instance, they're like, you never answer a question, because as soon as you do, you produce 10,000 new answers, right? I mean, 10,000 new questions. So this is like one of the delights and difficulties of like knowledge good agalmias, or these kinds of non-scarce realms, right? Is that data begets more data, knowledge begets more knowledge, precisely because answering questions only ever produces many, many more. And those questions are also self-directing, right? So like while it may not be clear in any given moment which way things move, the questions that are asked, the way that the answers are shaped, and the kinds of new questions that those predict have the self-perpetuating effects that leads us along certain directions in the pursuit of, in our case, wisdom. Right? It doesn't have to be that way, but hopefully we can, through humility, through listening, through gratitude, through honesty and intimacy, we can come to these kinds of things. They're decentralized and non-authoritarian, right? So there's no central planning authority. And primarily, I think these are built from what I'm calling functional invitations to playful spaces where we can leave marks. And those marks can encourage continuous contribution with indirect coordination. So the ant colony wakes up in the morning, and Mr. Ant A is an autonomous being, right? He's not part of the hive mind like you would, for instance, see in termites. He has his cup of coffee and he heads out on his day's work to go and find food. And along the way, nobody tells him which direction he should move in, but he can leave a trail as he moves. And then if he does find a food source, he can come back to the nest, leaving another kind of trail, a mark in the environment. If any other ant happens upon that trail while he's coming back to the nest, they know that food is in that direction and can move to it immediately without speaking to him or having to coordinate through some central authority. And in this particular way, the ability to leave marks in the environment such that others can learn from them allows the nest to explore its environment in the most optimal fashion in order to find the nourishment that it needs on a day-by-day basis. This is like a wonderful example of what in the literature is called stigmagy, and what I understand like decentralized and non-authoritarian environments to entail. It doesn't mean like tightly coupled direct coordination necessarily. And you'll see that a lot in kernel, right? Like we don't say to people, oh, you're both interested in like search and data, go and work together. Like, no, you're both interested in search and data, go on your adventures, talk to each other if you like, but also like don't if you don't want to. And like it's the ability to explore in various directions, leaving traces that others can learn from, which allows for the collection of wisdom over longer periods of time. And then they're positive sum, and they're not new, these agalmias, right? So this is not a new idea. The word itself is an old Greek one, right? Agalma in Greek, it means pleasing gift, right? Isn't that fun? Datum is something given, agalma is a pleasing gift. So these are like given in pleasing ways, and when they're open and shared, they are most valuable because they allow for more people to share in the facts that are established collectively, such that we can like ask better questions and continue along our way to collective wisdom. So when we look at these definitions, and I told you we'd come back to the idea of transfinity because it's really important for the entire guild. Here it says agalmic activity involves goods which are not scarce, so I can give you one without appreciably diminishing my supply, right? And as I said, I really care about language. And I'm like, well, what does this one really mean? And what does my supply imply, right? That seems a little bit strange, because if it's about like my supply and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 quantifiable goods, is very, very difficult to imagine what encoding that kind of idea in like reciprocal and interdependent ways actually means, right? Like it's one thing to speak at a high level about, oh, we need these transfer mechanisms which are naturally interdependent and which encode reciprocity. But if I'm still thinking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and my supply, it's really, really, really difficult to imagine what agalmics actually mean at the level of, for instance, tokens, right? Like if tokens have a set balance and that balance is interpreted only as an asset, and I think about like, okay, well, how would I turn this into an agalmia? Like if I give Ryan a token, I am diminishing my supply, right? This is not an agalmia. So like, how do I think about, what that notion of transfinity actually means at the level of code and protocols and data itself? I don't think that it's possible to. And the reason that I kind of hammer on this is because, again, in Module 7 in kernel, you will see that we talk a lot about the inertia of language, right? Despite the fact that we are trying to touch upon some new ideas or old new ideas about how we could relate and the kinds of transactions into which we could enter with one another and what that would imply about our relationships, we still use this old language which carries so many ideological traces about the separate individual my and certain Roman law notions of ownership, right? Like my supply, usus, abusus, and fructus, right, is how the Roman law defines ownership, right? The right to use, benefit from the fruits of fructus, and abuse, right? Abusus. It's coded into our law, right? The notion that ownership gives me the right to abuse. It pulls into the most intimate places in our lives, domestic scenes, the most incredible kinds of violence. And it's all there, right? And our language carries the traces of it. So even as we talk about transfinity and how we might have goods, the sharing of which might not diminish my supply, we betray the actual idea by the language that we still use in sometimes unconscious ways. So we have suggested an alternative definition for transfinity, which is that transfinite goods are those which I can transact without appreciably diminishing the value for which I am responsible. By making it slightly more diffuse, we can think in much more clear ways about what tokens and what other kinds of low-level linguistic primitives might best represent this particular idea, right? Because like if it's not about like one and my supply, but rather about value, right, and that which I am responsible for, then we can think in interesting ways about what these kinds of like tokens, transfer mechanisms, and their relationship with data might actually be, right? Because we can ask this question, like how do I actually transact without diminishing the value for which I'm responsible? Again, it's lovely to say that. What does it actually mean at the level of code? Well, the first is that you can encode reciprocity and interdependence by, for instance, using the information implicit in any transaction to add value to the overall exchange. These are like fancy words, but like the best conceptual explanation of it is given in this week's module by Nick Szabo in an essay about collectibles, where he makes the very simple points that like in Melanesia, there were these alternately circulating loops of necklaces made of particular kinds of shells and armbands made of particular kinds of shells. And these would circulate through the Melanesian islands seasonally, depending on like what kinds of food were being produced in different islands at different times. And what's most interesting about them is that, as they circulate, they pick up stories, right? So this suddenly is no longer just like an armband made of a particular kind of clam, which has a particular kind of value that is agreed upon and everybody uses as like a medium of exchange, right? And like a unit of account. But also it was like Vivek's armband, right? And because it was Vivek's armband, it's suddenly worth like 3 units more, right? Because it carries this narrative value. And so as the like armbands or necklaces circulate throughout the Kula network, the collection of information amortizes the cost of their transport, right? Like you have the same things moving in the closed loops of circulation, but they become more and more valuable because they pick up these like traces of contextual information about who owned them, right, for a particular time, about who was the person that they sat with, right? And that is really, really interesting. And like a direct analogy can be made to like tokens on the network, because it always, like, any transaction takes place within the context of a shared ledger, and that context can be used to imbue it with greater value. The like example of this at the level of code that like we've built in Prison Art, although I think there are like many others, was precisely, sorry, Prison Art was like a project from Kernel where like we take NFTs that are like digital artifacts of work done by incarcerated folks in the US. We sell those NFTs. The value from that flows back to a nonprofit organization who pays what are called legal financial obligations, which is a whole other story and how that works in the like prison system in the US. And then with the receipts, the proofs of payment of those LFOs, like we reattach those to the original artwork simultaneous to the moment that we send it to the person who originally bought it. You can do that using the transfer to function, the safe transfer function in ERC 721 standard. And you there get this feature where the aesthetic expression of inherent human dignity and the economic story of a human being's like return to society and the enactment of justice is tightly coupled, right? You can do that with programmable money. This is what I mean when I talk about like reciprocity and interdependence at the level of protocols, is that like by thinking about like these historical examples like the Kula network, you can begin to think about like what that actually means when you can program money. And all the code for this is open source. Again, I'm happy to share it in the channel after this presentation. But just to illustrate that these are not only like high-minded ideas, it is very, very possible today to do these kinds of things. You just have to think creatively about what it means to program money in order to achieve certain ends, like, for instance, making it like viable economically and economically to open the data sets that you work with. The other way that you can think about like transactions which do not diminish the value for which you are responsible is you can program tokens to be more than assets or liabilities. Right? We're so conditioned by the way that we've been taught in accounting classes or just from like existing in like the current banking system that we think there are only like at best assets, equity, and liabilities, right? And we have to like balance these across like a sheet, and like that's all there is, right? That like that's how we can like define financial systems. And I think that it's like a useful framework. Again, if you look in this week's module, you will see like that's there's a course taught by a man called Perry Merling at the Institute for New Economic Thought, and like thinking with balance sheets is a wonderful example of like the banker's version of complementary opposites, right? Like every debit must have a credit, every asset must be balanced by some liability. It's a wonderful procedure, enormously powerful, changed the world. But we have the ability to do more than that, right? So for instance, like an example of what it would mean to program a token that is more than just an asset or a liability is to take a token which is a representation not of an asset but of a liability, right? Like your promise to pay back something, and then make that token nevertheless that which gates access to a particular community chat or other forum of some kind, right? At the moment, the only way we think about like these kinds of tokens which grant us access to communities and give us governance rights are as assets, right? And when your governance token is also an asset, what you've done is you've merged the worst parts of market capitalism with tyranny. And you've done it very efficiently because now I have an asset which gives me the ability to govern others, which I think is horrifying. But when instead our tokens are representations, for instance, of our liabilities, our promises to pay that which we have been given, and nevertheless gate access to, for instance, community chats. That's really interesting, right? Because if I take on one of these tokens in order to join a community chat, all of a sudden, the incentive when I join that chat is not to figure out the most effective ways of governing the other people in that chat. It's to make relationships so that I can pay back the liability that I took on in order to get there, right? These are like very interesting and all, again, possible if we just think creatively about like what open goods really mean and are, and what like not just public goods are, but what is good for the public. So I need to get through the rest of this because I've been rambling a little bit, if you'll forgive me. I would love at this particular stage, before I dive into one last section, to hear any questions, if there are.
Feel free to unmute or raise hands if you'd like. Okay, maybe we start with Tom and then Richu, Arman.
Hey, yeah, so I'm first of all, I freaking love it. Like, you blew my mind every single 5 minutes. But what I'm thinking about is, how important is it to take into account the environment in which this happens? Because if you think on a way broader scale, like say, for example, data, like at some point there's the pure computational cost, or even the shells, right? Like at some point, maybe the story becomes so long that, you know, I don't know, like, are there boundaries to which it becomes diminishing? Do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah. I think that like thinking about the medium is critical, and that's like thinking about media in general is almost always like analogical with the boundary value problem in mathematics. So this was like a lot of what Marshall McLuhan and media theorists after him were talking about. Is like media and the medium being the message is like a wonderful summary of like the insight that like our media shape the messages that it's possible to send, just as the messages illuminate the medium itself. It's like we create our tools, and then our tools act back and create us. So we're in this constant dialogue with our tools in the world. We're in this constant dialogue with the messages in the media that we use to propagate them. And that does imply thinking much more about like constraints and boundaries rather than like the initial value, although both can be important. And like the best example that I've seen of this, Tom, is the Arweave yellow paper. The reason for that is because like they have had to do a lot of like thinking about the like cost of data storage over time and how that applies to the very pressing problem of like what it costs to put data in the SmartWeave today, right? And like they have some really, really, as far as I'm concerned, like probably the most complete like economic forecast of like data costs and the constraints on these kinds of systems over the next sort of 100 to 200 years. There's a lot of work that goes into that. The paper itself is like over 40 pages long, and there's like a lot of other interesting things in it. But in terms of like constraints and the actual computational requirements for these kinds of systems, that's probably the most interesting place to go. I think that they're like rather conservative in the way that they approach it, which is like, it makes me happy. And I think that that's probably a good thing in the long run. They're, there's lots of different things. There's like everything from Moore's law to like various others, which I'm like forgetting off the top of my head, that are like factor into the calculations that they've made about like what it will cost to store data over the next 200 years, which bears a very strong relationship to the amount of AR you need in order to put like a gig into Arweave today.
Andy, I'm not sure how much time you have budgeted here. We could go to Richu and then Arman are the two more questions.
Cool. Let's do it. I'll be quick.
Yeah. Mine's like I'm still struggling to understand the concept of no scarcity in the context that, like how you were talking about, the contextual value, like the armband that Vivek wore having more value, etc., which is very interesting, which is something that I'm also trying to implement. But also, like if it's entirely non-scarce, like in the broader context of an abundant society, it makes more sense. But like for the larger world, where it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like if you are not tackled and figure out the base layers, and if you're building for the top layers for places where it's not, it's will it stick, and will it make sense to that parts of the world is my question, I guess.
Well, I mean, the only way we figure that out is if we try. That's like the simple response to it. The slightly more involved one is that, like, again, to return to this Project Horseshoe paper on like pro-social game design, the point that they make, which is a profound one, is not that like scarcity or abundance is good or bad, right? It's just that when you're dealing with virtual goods like tokens and data, scarcity is not a limitation of the world. It is an aesthetic design choice, right? And so again, like, this is like far from like moral language. It's not saying like scarcity is good or bad or abundance is good or bad. It's saying that these are aesthetic choices about the way in which you want, in that context, your internal game economy to work. But like with blockchains now, like the internal game economy and the real economy have merged, right? And so like the question is like, what is the intention with which you are building, right? That's the initial value. What are the constraints that you actually need to pay attention to? These tend to be in like mechanism design. They tend to have much more to do with things like token sinks, the way that people spend tokens, the way that they're brought into existence, how value is related via different kinds of transactions, right? And like the important thing in that world is also that like what you want to try and do, right, if you're thinking about like these kinds of token and data as like aesthetic design choices, not material limitations of the world, is you want to think about like trying to create transactions which are not just win-loss, right? Like that's a much more economic way of saying what I've been saying today, i.e. like create transfer mechanisms that are naturally interdependent and reciprocal. In economic language, this means like create transactions which are not just win-loss, which is currently like the only real kind of transaction that we have in the world. And if you think about like the economic essay referenced in module 2 this week, right, that's the whole point that Peter Norvig is making in like this Python notebook, right? He's saying that like the initial distribution of wealth, the geographic dispersal of actors, all of these things which we traditionally think of as having great effects in terms of wealth inequality in our society, actually have almost no effect. What is like most important is the nature of transactions. If you only have win-loss transactions where like I get and you lose, or you get and I lose, this tends to increase the disparity over time. Now, like we need to think about ways in which we can like craft transactional media which are not just win-loss. And like I'm not saying that you need like an infinite token supply, right? I think that there are contexts in which that is probably not appropriate and where it won't serve the like intention of whatever good you are building. But you do need to recognize that the way in which tokens are brought into existence and the nature of transactions which occur around them are critical in order to create these kinds of knowledge good agalmias, right? And what's most critical about them is, can you get them to like think more deeply, right? Like and represent more accurately the like inherent reciprocity that is going on between like value and facts and how those are transferred using these shared ledgers. So yeah, we have to try, right? And while I don't think that like this naively means having like infinite token supplies, I do think that like thinking very, very carefully about like how tokens are created, how they're destroyed, and how that impacts the nature of transactions that occur within any given like agalmic or economic system is really, really critical.
Good deal. One from Holly in the chat, which again, let's see if we have time for everything, is there some data that should never be shared? And Holly's specifically thinking of the antidote to the Bushman poison described by Myber.
I love that. That's such a wonderful question. Yeah, I think so. It's a really, really wonderful question. I don't have a clear perspective on it at the moment. I think so, right? The reason that I don't have a fully clear perspective on it is that I wonder if there are ways of ensuring the preservation of that knowledge without necessarily making it entirely accessible. That's one of the tensions that so much of that kind of knowledge in the world exhibits, right? I think that what's interesting, right, even about the nature of the question, right, is that we know that there is an antidote. And that's kind of fascinating, isn't it? We don't have to know what the antidote is necessarily, but we know that there's this very, very particular kind of poison, and that there is an antidote, and perhaps that is enough in certain cases. That is open enough, because that's the question that we'll get onto in preceding weeks, right? As we get into the technicalities of Dune dashboards and subgraphs and IPFS and all of this kind of stuff. It's okay, how open is open? What does that really mean? And yeah, I don't have time fully to go into it today, but it's really interesting to me that we know that there is an antidote, because that nevertheless influences our behavior, right? And that's got to do with the psychosocial aspect of what value is, not just facts recorded against keys in a shared ledger, but trust in clearly shared truths, or trust in that which is given. So
I see Maria, and then I realized, sorry, Armand, we have to get back to you, but Maria, if you'd like.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking in so many examples in which the transfer of data and that information does not provide knowledge, but that can create a lot of harm. I don't know, see a lot of examples of the correct data or the incorrect content being shared, and the fact that you're allowing these mechanisms for fast share and multiplication, you're not protecting the people, and you end up harming them, and they are not being cared for, so.
Yeah, I think so this is a common criticism of open open data advocates, or what in the current nomenclature has come to be called the solar punk ethic, associated with many people in Ethereum or other parts of crypto and cryptography or cryptocurrency, as opposed to the lunar punk thing of privacy needs to be first. We need to be protecting the people that we're building systems for. We need to be much more careful about the ways in which we handle data and all of this kind of stuff. And I perhaps should have said this at the beginning, because you're absolutely right. And I am certainly not advocating for the irresponsible or naively open use of data. What I am trying to illustrate here is that there are very, very particular mechanisms by which we can architect an open data landscape that does not preclude the use of tools like zero knowledge proofs, or there are various other ones that I want to go into right now, because those will come in the more technical parts of this guild. It's a question of where the thing starts from, right? That's what I'm trying to illustrate, is that if you start from closed and siloed systems, you can never get to the kind of agalmia that I'm trying to illustrate here. If you have that, it is more than possible, and in fact fairly trivial at some level, right? Certainly conceptually, to protect the information which needs to be protected, precisely because and it's the same feature that you see in open source software, right? It's far more secure than any bank, right? And there are two reasons for this. The one is practical, that there's simply more eyes on it and more ways in which it has been tested and attacked. Bitcoin, has actually had many bugs, right? It's not that it's never been hacked. It's it had many bugs. And the reason that we know about them and are constantly able to improve the software is precisely because the source is open and you can examine it and verify it for yourself. This doesn't mean that therefore the privacy of everybody that uses the network is compromised. It just means that the architecture allows for very particular kinds of interactions, and then also enables the application of certain contextual and appropriate technologies where it's necessary. So like the same thing applies here, right? Like I think that the architecture that we build, it needs to be fundamentally shared. It needs to be open. It needs to be agalmic, right? That does not preclude us like making sure that like your social security number is never leaked and like you can't be impersonated by somebody with bad intentions. Like all of these things absolutely need to happen. And I don't think that like open architectures preclude it. I actually think that they make it possible in far more robust ways, because the way that it currently happens, right, is that like you hand over your information to the bank in order to do KYC and AML. You hand your information over to various other people. They maintain databases very, very badly, right? I know this because like somebody hacked the Department of Home Affairs in South Africa and took everything. So my data is somewhere online, all of it, right? Not just like my social security number, everything, right? If you want to impersonate me, I'm sure that there's like somebody out there who you could like contact and be like, hey, I heard you hacked the South African Department of Home Affairs. Let me have the data, bro. And off you go, right? Like, whereas if we have like shared systems that are open source, we can like make them much more robust and resilient, and we can introduce economic incentives to them, which make hacking them like not just technically difficult, but economically infeasible, right? And this is like the difference between threat models and cost models, which we'll speak about in module 6. It's also the reason that Bitcoin has never been stopped, right? Like while there have been bugs in the code that have needed to be fixed, even if you can hack Bitcoin, even if you could get 51% of the network hash rate and find like a means of like changing the code such that you could like, for instance, double spend tokens or allocate to yourself a greater balance, you still wouldn't do it because it would destroy entirely the value of that which you were able to hack, right? If people could prove that the 21 million limits had been overturned or that double spending was suddenly possible, the price of Bitcoin would crash. Right. And so like there's no economic incentive to hack the network, in addition to the fact that it's open source and that you have this like feature of many eyes and shallow bugs. So like that's really interesting, right? It's really, really interesting to me. Again, it doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect. It just means that like we can progressively and iteratively over time create much more resilient infrastructure precisely because it's shared and it's open. And that's like a little bit paradoxical, but like it is, like we see it in the world, like in front of us right now. We need to. I want to come to these questions in a moment. I want to just. Okay, one more. Oh man.
Yeah. Oh, wait, I'll just turn my video off because I'm sitting dark. Yeah, so like about the paradox of like sharing data that might cause more harm, and what you just discussed now, that like if the data is more open source, we are far more prone to identifying the bugs in it. So like I feel that we are still meeting the goal of like, keeping data open source, because as soon as we find that shared truth is not really what is of like a greater social cause for the community and such, we are we are bound to like remove it and such, right? So like I don't really find it paradoxical. What are your thoughts on like sharing all kinds of data and like finding bugs in it? Because again, like we just mentioned about like the rolling stone gathers no moss, so it's like the data we continue to share, the facts we continue to share, or the shared truths we continue to like just propagate from one community to other. The more we share it, the more we are able to like identify and improvise on it. Is it the case in like open source data? This is a very generic question in a way, but yeah, I hope you got what I meant.
Sure. And just to emphasize, like I'm still speaking like analogically, right? So that
Yeah.
like I think that the systems that we build that allow us to store and transfer data, remembering that storage is just a subset of transfer over time, are what needs to be open source, right? Like the data itself, like can be accessible, but there can be like additional rules applied to like the like access of that data based on like open and verifiable economic incentives, for instance, right? So like it doesn't have to be that the data itself is necessarily open source, because like that does become problematic in terms of like potentially sharing like damaging information, because like when we share data, particularly in the context of like blockchains, right, like these append only ledgers, there is a sense in which like one has to be like enormously careful about like what actual data gets put there, because like it could be damaging not today but like much later on down the line, right? So like there is like a great deal of nuance in like what I'm trying to say, but like to the point, right, like the architecture, the way in which things are shared, the way in which stuff is transferred, the ability for anybody to participate in that is what's critical here. The actual like datum itself, that which is given, like gifts can like have like conditions attached to them, right? Like that it changes the nature of the gift, but that doesn't mean that it's not valid, right? Like it's just that like we need to think in like really nuanced ways about the like what a Gulmia means, what transfer mechanisms are, what reciprocity and independence mean, and like how those can be put together in order to enable like resilience and shared systems that do bring us closer toward collective wisdom without endangering individuals in order to get there, right? Like I think that all of these things are possible. I really do. And like the place that I start from is like, okay, open architecture, open ways of sharing. And then we can have like nuanced and informed discussions about what is being shared and with what conditions, protections, other things. So
that makes more sense. And
this
no, like I was just sorry, go ahead. I'm so sorry.
Please carry on, Ahmed.
No. I was just saying, like, as a comment, that David mentioned, like, having like a consensus based framework that like promotes open source data, but like with a grain of salt. And the grain of salt is like kind of provided by the Luna Punk aspect of like, privacy and such. Like, that's all what I like wanted to add.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's very true. So the question that I now have like 8 minutes to cover, which I will do, is what is an appropriately designed knowledge Gurugamiya? We said at the beginning of this presentation, appropriately designed knowledge Gurugamiyas are those in which smart players are an advantage. More smart players are an advantage, not a threat. And like I've been referencing this piece all throughout the presentation. It's in module 5. You have here like examples of like the kinds of things that might contribute toward like pro-social knowledge Gurugamias. It's like friendship, trust, positive sum resources, knowledge in particular, voting resources done in like interesting and nuanced ways, interdependent roles, shared vulnerability, player-to-player trade, and tying social metrics to business success. Each one of those has like a whole bunch of information underneath it that's like you can go and read if you're interested. I think that's like what is most critical about these pro-social knowledge Gurugamias is like the open nature of participation, right? Because the ability to establish any given fact by participating in a network is what may be used to create these knowledge Gurugamias. And in particular, like participation matters because your interaction with any datum, with something given, gives it both structure and context, right? This is like the old idea that we constantly reference in kernel, that like when I give you a gift, it doesn't exist as a gift. It's only when you interpret it as such that the gift comes into existence, right? Because like as in that moment of giving, it can be interpreted in so many different ways. It can be interpreted as social manipulation, me trying to get one over you, me trying to earn like a false reputation. There's so many different things that act can be seen as. And it's only when the receiver in good faith interprets it as a gift that it truly exists, because it's that interpretation, it's that observation on the receiver's behalf that gives it the properties, i.e. it gives it the structure and the context to be seen as a gift. So it's the same thing here, right? Like your participation in a network is what like gives structure and context to the data in that network, which may be used to engender useful knowledge. And a really like important point here is that the more diverse the participants in any given network, the more uses the knowledge will have. We know this intuitively, like it's very obvious, but it's worth like saying and just emphasizing, because it's really important to recognize that diversity is not just an ethical imperative. It is an evolutionary response to adversity, right? Like we have to have diversity if we want to survive difficult environments. That's how life works. In order to get access to different seeds, the finch develops a different kind of beak on different islands, right? It's like this is like a variation across species in different environments is exactly what like the mechanism is by which life propagates itself. So when we recognize all of that, we recognize like this final thing, which is that like it creates a tension between the volume of any new information required to keep a set of data lively, right? Like you need new participants and people adding to like the knowledge repository or the data over time in order to keep it interesting and to keep people's attention coming back to it as somewhere valuable that is worth like contributing to or like curating stuff from. But if you have too many new people and too much new information coming in very rapidly, that data repository becomes illegible and unnavigable, so it loses its use. There's some really, really fine line between like the amount of attention and information coming in to keep it lively and worthwhile, and too much that makes it like just completely overwhelming. Where is that fine line? Well, you know, we've kind of talked a little bit about it, and I think that you can like when you recognize that crafting tokens and having these protocols attached, like protocols for open data, you know, we recognize that we can like create costs to contribute. However, we can craft those costs in such a way that they're not exclusive or not arbitrarily exclusive. And that's what's really important about this, because we can then establish common knowledge about what the rules for contribution are without instituting any rulers that make arbitrary decisions about any participant. And like, again, this gives us like a much finer appreciation of context. It's not to say that like it's a silver bullet or it's definitely like the way that's like we save the world, right? It's just that this is a massive improvement over current knowledge systems. And the means by which we achieve that is by like having markets, right? As strange as it is to say that near the end of this particular presentation, like markets are the most effective mechanism we know for the allocation of goods and resources. The problem with many markets that exist in the world is that they're not actually neutral, and they're certainly not independent of governance and politics. But like the market as an independent mechanism, a truly free market, which I don't think exists in the world at the moment, is the most effective mechanism we know for the like allocation of goods. And agalmias being like the study and practice of the production and allocation of non-scarce resources, like the natural like mechanism that needs to be embedded within that is a free market. And like, again, like free market here, it's really important that we understand that like these free markets are established by shared rules, right? Consensus. And consensus doesn't mean agreeing about stuff. It just means that we are all able to like understand and verify for ourselves the rules by which any particular network operates, right? There are multiple networks though. That's the whole point, is that like, you don't just need one network, you don't just need one market, right? Like there has been a great deal of work over many, many generations to try and understand how it is that we could come up with a universal book or a universal library. The work that was called the Mundaneum. After World War I, a man called George Otley was funded by the League of Nations to build the Mundaneum based on another work called the Universal Book by Andrew Ramsey. And like Otley recognized you don't need a book, you need a library, right? And like, if I can build a library funded by the League of Nations, which documents all of human knowledge and makes it easy to consult, I can ensure world peace, right? There's a few like logical leaps that I'm like leaving out in this particular story, but the like insight now, right, is that it's not just a book and it's not just a library. It is like a plurality of libraries. You need like many, many different repositories and many different kinds of markets in order to provide like the context, right, the shape of the network and the way these different libraries or repositories interact with one another, in order to like inform the like intuitive choice of any particular datum at any particular time, right? Like it's not just enough to have like one library that is shaped according to the umwelt of like one particular group of people or one particular language group or one particular field of study. You need many of these different ones that are networked in relation to one another in order to create and craft the context that produces the most effective searches, which can help us facilitate friendship, right? In particular, like the final point that I'll make, because I'm now out of time, and if you need to drop, please do. I generally really try hard to respect people's time. So the final point here is that like the shape of these networks, the way in which our like data repositories relate to one another as a result of the protocols that we use to transfer and share information in reciprocally enriching ways, is not just a science, right? It is an art. And while we will do a lot of data science in the next 3 sessions, remember this point, that it has as much to do with art as it does with science. And like that is because art can help us not explore not just like the shape of relationships between repositories in the network, but the form and pattern within each repository that makes it open in an ethical sense, right? Because I've been avoiding that particular connotation of the word open until like the end here, that there is not just like a sense of like participatory openness, but also like some ethical dimension and imperative that is implied by building these kinds of systems. And the state of the art is not actually these dynamic knowledge repositories, which is an idea that comes from Doug Engelbart. It's community gardens. And the reason for that is that these gardens have a whole bunch of features, which is listed on this slide, and which relates to the 8 features of a GAL mix that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. In particular, right, garden care requires ecological intelligence and cultivated awareness. Like these 2 things, as people who work within like open data systems, will be critical for the success of any work that we do. So finally, like we're not just looking for artificial intelligence, but the intelligent artifices which can best augment natural growth and decay by virtue of the care with which they respond to their environment. If you look at the essay in this final section, you will see that I've given some examples of what these kind of intelligent artifices might look like. Finally, like the goal of all of this searching, right? I've suggested like a few goals as we've gone through this presentation, and I'm sorry that it's taken me so long to get through it all. But the goal of all the searching is, as it's always been, right? Friendship, fraternity, and peace. Certainly the work towards some kind of universal library was always about peace. I think that like friendship helps us frame it in more humble and accessible ways. The Mundaneum was stormed by the Third Reich and turned into a museum theater. And we don't want to create the conditions that might lead to that kind of outcome again. So I think that's asking about friendship first is a wonderful thing. Can open data facilitate friendship? And I think that that's a really, really important framing question for the rest of the guild. And thank you so much for listening to all that I have to say. I'm available for the next 12 minutes. If you are like around and you would like to ask questions, then we can absolutely do that. But if you're not and you need to go, I completely understand. And thank you so much for all of your kind attention. Stop the share.
Thank you. Thank you. See everybody soon.
Risha, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, yeah, just since you said you're available for the next 10 minutes, I just want to ask so we are like on a broader perspective, we are trying to build trustful relationships, but in blockchain, in a decentralized manner, what you're fundamentally trying to do is enable trustless transactions, right? Where like smart contracts fundamentally is about, you don't have to trust the other person to transact with the person, because the contract ensures that these are the kind of constraints. Like again, the constraints aspect comes in, like these are the constraints in which that person will be behaving. So you are ensured that these are sets of outputs that will be coming out from that particular transaction. So I'm just wondering where's the intersection of these two sorts of philosophies, or like where that shift happened from a trustless transaction to an enabling trust. I mean, it's awesome if you trust each other all the time, everyone else, but I guess it's like mitigating the worst case scenario kind of aspect. I don't know. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, like for me, and I think that like the point is sort of like quite well made, hopefully, in like module 1 of like the syllabus, right? Which is that in fact module 0 in the trust piece, right? It says that like trust in protocols, right? Like forming trustless protocols requires encoding and defining exactly what it means to cheat, right? Now, when we do that at the level of protocols, you can have like media which do not rely on intermediaries, which is a funny way of putting it, but quite revealing. And that is what people mean by trustless, right? Like you don't have to rely on others for the message to propagate through the medium in the way that you intend it to. But like the message always has to be interpreted on the other end, right? Like the message propagating through the medium in the way that you intend it to is only half the deal, right? I give you the gift, but it doesn't exist as gift until you interpret it as such. So like that act of interpretation cannot be controlled by the media, right? Like the media can only ever deliver to you the message as it was intended to be sent. You still have to interpret that message. And so there's like two different levels at which we're talking about trust, right? We're talking about trust as in intermediary-lessness, right? The ability for messages to propagate through a media as I intend them to. But then also the trust that we have to have in other people to interpret our actions or our words in ways that we meant them, right? And that's a far more messy phenomena, right? It's got to do with linguistics, psychology, sociology, culture, all sorts of things, politics, and like it's that, again, double